Young had been uninterested in Pendragon from the start. Pendragon was strong, but not to a level where Young was worried about him. In any case, it seemed that Young's victory was decided, and he knew that no matter how desperate Pendragon was, he was grossly inferior. However, Pendragon's teacher was different. The Dragon Lord Han Sung. The closest man to humanity's strongest person. He was in a godlike territory, especially when he fought with dragons. It was said that even the demon kings spared themselves when he approached. Even Young had only been able to assassinate him after 3 years because he had been fortunate. At the time he had been tired and exhausted. However, I want to challenge him. Instead of an assassination, he wanted to have a fair fight. That was why he continuously threw speculation during the fight with Pendragon. It was to elicit a response from Han Sung. Also, by the looks of it, Han Sung had been caught. The complete defeat of his student. No matter how uninterested he had been, he now had no choice but to be interested. You're certainly strong. However, you are too arrogant. Han Sung also completely read Young's intentions. And he could get a sense of Young's boundless confidence. Such confidence against him, the Dragon Lord. Of course, it was better than nothing, but it was excessive. There were many times when doing too much was worse than doing nothing at all. Pendragon was just a rookie. On the other hand, Young was a master. Han Sung had felt that Young was one of a kind ever since the first time he had met him. Experts can't hide all their strength even if they tried. It was more easily recognizable to someone like Han Sung. If he moderated his movements and regulated even his heartbeat, then he could never be ordinary. An outrageous purity of divine power. He was a supernova that appeared from who knew where, but Han Sung was called a monarch, because he was undefeated. Sword fragment. Young said shortly. The sword fragment Han Sung had showed the Saintess. Something thought to belong to Kingslayer. You mean that if you win, I'm to give you the sword fragment? But Young's response was clear. Han Sung tilted the corners of his lips. If his self-confidence was to this extent, it surpassed unpleasantness and was fun. Since it wasn't like he never received this kind of challenge because he was the Dragon Lord. Fine. However, if I win, what will you give me? Traditionally, favorable bets had to be made on both sides. The Dragon Lord alone couldn't bet the sword fragment. Then Young withdrew the sage's potion from his chest. Oh, I see. If it's the sage's potion, it's a bit tempting. The sage's potion was worth calling the bet. They were so extremely rare that even some large groups did not even possess a few. It was enough to support the very best prospects. Han Sung did not have a place for enemies. In other words, there was a limit to the supply and demand of sage's potions. Without a doubt, there would be a few of Pendragon's stats that weren't even enlightened. For the love of his student. Fine. I accept. He had no choice but to bite. In any case, he had no thoughts of losing. Then Han Sung shook his head. Saintess, can you keep the process and outcome of this fight a secret? All right. Only the Saintess, Seraphina, Young, Han Sung and Pendragon were inside the large castle. If the fight with Han Sung started, it was highly possible that priests and paladins would gather, since they would also want to see a fight with the man who was closest to being humanity's strongest. However, the current Han Sung didn't want to be seen by any others. After the chaos had passed and his true character as a hero was revealed. Only then, not now. Before becoming a hero, while I exist utterly as Han Sung. He had the thought that he wanted to fight with him and make his own light shine distinctly. Young lifted his head and withdrew anguish. Fung. Anguish cried. A battle of pure swordsmanship. Even so, the skills that Young was able to use were only acceleration and grains. He couldn't use any skill dealing with death here, and the other skills were too distinctive. Young had become famous as an angel precisely because of skills like those. On the other hand, Young's equipment and such were not so well known. Win. Young certainly had no thoughts of losing. Of course, this would be a difficult fight. An opponent who he might lose or win against even if he used all he had. so he put a restriction on himself. However, the same was true for Hansung. Hansung's true character appeared when he was with Arkisa. The magical dragon Arkisa was not here. Well then, let's start. Hansung held dual swords. He was a master of dual-wielding swordsmanship. Also, he was the owner of 3 types of secret classes: Contractor of Dragons, Master of 100 Swords, and Iron Knight. Furthermore, all 3 of them had synergetic effects on each other. Muyang and Hansung stared at each other for a while. Nobody moved first. Hundreds and thousands of scenarios were rising up in Muyang's mind. What path and speed should he use, and how he should penetrate? Or how to defend? He was searching for the most optimal one. The same went for Hansung. I thought you would jump at me to your heart's content. It was a surprise. Muyang was concentrating extremely. More carefully than anyone else. When Muyang had first thrown speculation at him, Hansung had seen him as just a power-drunk and arrogant fellow, but after entering a fight with him he realized that it was just a display. He just wanted me to respond. So, Hansung looked at Muyang again. And if that were true, then he couldn't lose this fight even more. Hansung decided to take it a little more seriously. And he read one among thousands of cases. I found it. Hansung found a way a step faster than Muyang. He slightly lowered his upper body and wielded his swords with both hands. The wind resistance was minimal, and in the blink of an eye he was standing in front of Muyang. And like it was nothing, he naturally invaded Muyang's territory. There was no knock on the door. Indeed, an entry without warning. The rhythm is different. Muyang stepped back with a frown. He attacked without warning and invaded his space. Usually he would not suffer, but Hansung's rhythm was different to normal people. He was able to tell with just one glance. His armor was scratched. It was light because of his dramatic response. If he had been a little late he would have lost his waist. The corner of Muyang's mouth quivered. Hansung was facing him sincerely. He was truly trying to kill Muyang. He certainly didn't know how to do things in moderation. This is fun. Muyang immediately launched a counterattack. He swung Anguish horizontally. Hansung blocked it with a sword, but a crack appeared. One of the twin swords soon burst into light. He hit the grain in anticipation of his reaction. But Hansung brushed off his hands as if it were nothing. Then another sword was created. The sword he used in the beginning was just a tangible sword. The master of 100 swords. As the word suggested, he was carrying 100 types of swords. However, there was no real shape, and when a skill was used, the intangible sword was able to take shape and be manifested to the world. However, he seemed somewhat surprised. Muyang certainly had a rhythm that was different to ordinary people. His body's rhythm, sensation, everything. In a moment, Hansung's figure disappeared. A blind spot. Muyang immediately threw himself sideways. However, Hansung's plan was the place where Muyang threw himself. Muyang was hit in the foot and his body was pinned to a palace pillar. Muyang dusted off his head and stood up. A match of pure swordsmanship. It wasn't enough for them to just be 1 or 2 steps ahead. In the end, it was a fight of how many steps they thought of ahead. In terms of simple skills, Hansung was slightly superior. Could be said that Hansung had the upper hand in swordsmanship itself. Rather than hack and slash, he had a sense for swordsmanship. However, Muyang had one shot. Muyang's attacks were all fatal. With only one shot it was possible for him to overturn everything. Hansung was realizing this instinctively. Because of that, he was taking caution in attacking in order not to allow him to counterattack. It's like fighting a gigantic steel giant. Among Alexandra's trials, if he was to point out the most difficult thing, it would certainly be the triathlon with the steel giant. In that place Muyang lost countlessly. However, he continuously challenged it. It was fun and rewarding. That was the case with the current fight. Muyang spoke. Let's do this properly. He stretched his neck both ways while properly grasping Anguish. He was done testing the waters. The Saintess, Seraphina and Pendragon could not believe the present situation. That he was a human that could fight on even ground with Han Sung. Even so, Seraphina was less shocked. Because she firmly believed that Muyang was an angel. On the contrary, it was to the extent that she thought he could win against even Han Sung if he spread his wings. On the other hand, Pendragon's pupils shook violently. He's fighting on even ground with teacher? If it was with that level of ability, then he'd had no hope from the beginning. Simply put, like trying to break a rock with an egg. Even if he hit it 100 times, the rock would not break. Pendragon was an egg. Muyang was a gigantic boulder. He realized that now. Mortification, shame, and numerous mixed emotions dominated his body. However, Pendragon watched Seraphina. Seraphina did not take her eyes off of Muyang. She watched his every move. She seemed totally oblivious of Pendragon's gaze. I lost. He acknowledged it. He had to. What would be the point of becoming the first knight? In the end, he wouldn't be able to win Seraphina's heart. He had been angry during the fight, but if there was this level of a skill gap, he would only have been ridiculous. Seraphina's cheeks were flushed. She was not a woman who had fallen in love. She was too expressionless for that. She was just concentrating. She was thinking that in this world there was only Muyang. Perhaps she had even forgotten that Pendragon existed. What Muyang was showing was to the extent that even if it was simple swordsmanship, it was enough to overwhelm everything. To do more, it was pointless. Pendragon bowed his head. It was a long time since he had felt this sense of defeat. Tears gathered slightly in his eyes. They were tears that marked the end of his first love. I will become stronger. Pendragon wiped his eyes and looked back at the progress of the battle. Finally, the fight was drawing to a close. Muyang had shattered around 90 of the swords Han Sung carried. He wielded 100, but he was almost at his limit. Muyang's flow was certainly abnormal. Because he suddenly got faster or slower. Even so, Han Sung didn't collapse. On the contrary, he cornered Muyang more fiercely and stabbed at his whole body. His suit of armor was already in tatters. Schwak. Finally, he cut even his helmet. However, only the corner of his mouth was exposed. He was laughing. Anyone could see that Han Sung had the upper hand. In reality, Muyang was slowly getting closer to using all of his strength. Someone who is enjoying it can't be beat. Pendragon gritted his teeth. He was sincerely enjoying the fight. Fuck. Muyang was not just suffering. In his half-collapsed state, anguish had pierced Han Sung's thigh. Han Sung also gave Muyang's shoulder a long cut. After this, they began to slash at each other. They both got back up like Daruma dolls. Half a day passed since then. Amazing. How much had they fought? As if Han Sung was pleased, his teeth showed when he laughed. Blood covered their eyes. Their entire bodies were in tatters. A case where it wouldn't be strange even if they both died. No one could stop them. Because it seemed that the moment they stopped fighting, an even greater harm would occur. Because they were both standing at sword point. It was not a fight that ended when one side stopped. Muyang didn't answer. No, he didn't have the energy to respond. But they both collapsed simultaneously. A fight that had lasted about a day and a half. Everyone was silent. It was unbelievable. Meanwhile, the Dragon Lord Han Sung and a nameless man fought to a standstill. Something that couldn't happen, that shouldn't happen, was happening before them. Gulp. How? The Saintess was the first to speak. She carefully approached them. The Dragon Lord was like a symbol to humanity. If even one person found out that someone like that was defeated, many people would be shaken. However, it might be different if his opponent was worthy of representing humanity. Therefore, she had to be sure. Seraphina stopped the Saintess when she tried to remove Muyang's helmet. Saintess, I will treat my seed. I entrust Hansung Nim to you. That's right. First pray for healing. The Saintess couldn't come to her senses. It was because she too had certainly thought that Han Sung was humanity's strongest for a long time. Pendragon was merely standing and staring vacantly. Gasp. It was at that time. Han Sung sat up. It was because the dragon's powerful magic flowed through Han Sung's body and healed him. Actually, the regenerative power was beyond imagination thanks to Arceus's magic, and unless Han Sung's throat or heart were pierced he would not die. Tui. Han Sung spat out the dead blood. And he unsteadily got to his feet. He is a monster-like guy. It was Han Sung's admiration of Muyang. Where had a monster like this been born? If not for Arceus's magic he would have had to devote months to his recovery. It had been 10 years since the dragon's skin and regenerative powers had been activated. As Han Sung took a step forward, Seraphina blocked him again. I will take care of my seed. I'm not trying to see his face. You and this man called Gale seem to be hiding something, but fortunately it seems like he is recovering on his own. Han Sung had only gotten close to Muyang to check his condition. A small light appeared over Muyang's entire body. Divine powers and healing skills had been automatically activated and were healing his body. However, the light was weak. It was because he had used recovery generously during their fight. Ha! Han Sung smirked inwardly. The recovery skill Muyang used was not recovery, but almost to the point of restoration. He'd used it about 5 times, but each time he did his attacks became more vicious. Since then he'd thought that Muyang was running out of divine power, but meanwhile, it seemed that he had been filled up little by little. It wasn't only the purity that was high. His ability to regenerate divine power was also exceptional. How could he not be called a monster? Teacher. You won. Pendragon hesitantly ran over. His previously vacant expression had suddenly disappeared. He looked relieved if anything. However, Han Sung shook his head. If he had only a little more divine power remaining, I would have been defeated. No. Then he put his hand on his forehead and sighed. Had he won? Could he seriously say that he had won? It was uncomfortable. It was as if Muyang had not revealed his abilities. Of course, that was also true for Han Sung. Because he had not been with Arceus, and he hadn't used the aces up his sleeve either. Techniques such as sword keyblades or storm surge. Because it was a battle of pure swordsmanship, he didn't use them. He only used basic skills that assisted with swordsmanship. However, Han Sung was the Dragon Lord. With the name of Lord he always had to be overwhelming. But they achieved the idea of a draw. Even if each of them was concealing considerable power, it was no excuse. Han Sung shut his eyes. As a result, it could not be said that he had won this fight. Furthermore, during their fight Han Sung had missed Muyang multiple times. Soon Han Sung spoke heavily. I feel lost. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Muyang opened his eyes. He frowned at the bright light coming through the window. Amazing. As he raised his upper body he pondered his last memories. He could remember up to both him and Han Sung falling with great injuries. It seemed that he had lost consciousness after that. However, when he recalled the fight with the Dragon Lord he felt strange. The Dragon Lord hadn't put his heart into it. That had not been all of the power of the Dragon Lord Han Sung that Muyang remembered. He was someone that had command of sword key blades, which overlaid powerful energy on his sword, and storm surge that freely sent 100 swords flying simultaneously. However, Muyang also hadn't shown his true power. No powers associated with darkness had been used. He'd only used up to 8 times acceleration. Muyang was able to let time flow at a maximum of 16 times acceleration, however he had only used half. Of course, even if they used all they had, the probability of Muyang winning wasn't even 30%. If Arceus appeared and Han Sung used Storm Surge, and Muyang used all the undead to attack, his winning rate would be less than 30%. So that the idea of them both collapsing could only be amazing. Arceus is a dragon that can't be compared to Barca. Barca, who he had hunted with the dwarves, was a much younger dragon. On the other hand, Arceus was one of the most powerful of the adult dragons. She was beyond comparison. Muyang smiled faintly. Anyway, it had been a legitimate battle and not an assassination. If Muyang had been victorious here, he would have been disappointed instead. However, Muyang cleanly acknowledged it. He had lost. Han Sung was as strong as ever, tenacious and a wall-like being. Indeed, he was worthy of the hero title. Although he had been brainwashed, he could still remember the 3 years he'd had Han Sung under surveillance. Muyang was the only one in the world that knew the struggles and complications Han Sung had endured. Hero material. Wasn't he such an amazing man, whether 40 years before or after? However, it did not seem that he would be forever impossible to surpass. Because Muyang's growth rate far surpassed their imagination. And not only Han Sung, but the day where he could deal with Arkisa at the same time was surely coming. You've awoken. Shortly afterwards, the door opened and Serafina entered. There was a bowl filled with water and a towel in her hands. She sat beside him with natural grace. Then she dipped the towel into the water and squeezed it out. What are you doing? You've sweated a lot. I will wipe it off for you. Serafina carefully wiped Muyang's upper body. Wipe. Wipe. A brief pause. To have someone cleaning him was unfamiliar. Then Muyang asked, how did the trial of the first night go? You passed. The Saintess will send the formal documents of affirmation to you. By the time we get to Suicide Hill, everything will be completed. Okay. Excuse me, but your arm, please. Muyang held out his right arm. The feeling of the towel coming up carefully against his side wasn't too bad. Han Sung, how is he? He recovered quickly and was wielding a sword in the palace yesterday. If he had the magical dragon Arkisa's magical powers, Muyang would have recovered soon after he lost consciousness. His heart raced. If he was wielding a sword in yesterday's palace, it meant that he was reliving the fight with Muyang. He must have also gained something from Muyang. As expected, Muyang had also gained a little enlightenment from Han Sung's swordsmanship. I have to get up. Are you okay? Your body is still. My body has fully recovered. The divine blessing had automatically manifested. Thanks to that, his body itself was unencumbered. A new suit of armor and helmet hung on the wall of the room. As Muyang turned his head to look at them, Serafina said, don't worry. No one saw your face. She had stayed up all night by his side while he slept. She had protected him in case someone tried to investigate Muyang. Muyang nodded and raised his body up in bed. There is a lot of time left until I find the god-killing spear. A productive use of the time came to mind. Let's fight once more. Muyang, who had searched the castle, said when he saw Han Sung. Han Sung, who was wielding a sword, furrowed his brows. Come to think of it, didn't they say you weren't good at speaking? That meant you only talk when you want to. Muyang searched in his chest. Then he withdrew the sage's potion. Take it. Did you think you lost yesterday's fight? Yes. No. I lost. So you don't have to give me the potion. With a shake of his head, Han Sung withdrew the sword fragment from his chest. However, Muyang didn't take it. The reward was granted only to the winner. However, Muyang had completely lost yesterday's fight. I lost. Oh ho. It was I that lost. Neither of them broke their stubbornness. It was a stance of acknowledging personal defeat, but neither of them gave an inch. I fell first. We fell simultaneously. The person to rise first was definitely you. It wasn't me, it was because of Arkisa's magical powers. You won. Didn't use your full power. Your words are a little short. Isn't that the same for you anyway? I lost. My words aren't getting through to you. Han Sung clicked his tongue with a shake of his head. However, his lips lifted in a slight smile. I have no choice. I have to fight again and make a decision. Han Sung too was just remembering yesterday's fight. Muyang's fight was the type that Han Sung had not been able to experience. It was so gruesome and aggressive. I won't use any skills. Do you mean to fight purely? Another rule was set yesterday. Muyang nodded his head. This is fun. Han Sung summoned a sword. This time it was not a dual sword. 10 swords appeared, then merged together. 10 swords. When 100 swords were combined, finally the real 100 swords was completed. That was the true meaning of 100 swords. Among them the 10 swords was used. The fact that he revealed this sword meant he acknowledged Muyang as a true opponent. This was certainly a different attitude from yesterday. But I can choose the sword I will use, right? But Muyang consented and pulled out Anguish. Feng. Anguish cried out increasingly louder. More than 10 days passed in the palace. Muyang fought every day. He clashed blades with Han Sung. And every day he grew in a different way. Pure growth that was not assisted by anything. Han Sung was astonished by Muyang's appearance, which changed daily. However, he didn't try to see Muyang's face. He displayed no signs of being even curious about it. Muyang wondered why he did not. 10 days passed, then Muyang asked, "Aren't you curious about who I am?" "I am not curious." "Why was that?" Muyang's eyes asked. Han Sung chuckled. "In my life I meet many types of people. There is little point in trying to find out about people that are just passing by. And there is no point in deliberately trying to find out about people I will meet continuously. Because I will naturally get to know them anyways." "Which type are you?" For the first time Muyang understood Han Sung's words. Han Sung was thinking of Muyang as someone he will meet continuously. If they walked a similar path they would continue to meet. Of course the day would come when he would naturally get to know Muyang, but there was no need to force it for a moment's curiosity. Han Sung watched the sunset outside of the palace. Flap, flap. Finally, Arkisa descended from the sky with a flap of her wings. Han Sung slowly climbed on top of Arkisa. "I have to leave now. I have to go to the sage's room and find out about what the king of the dragons asked of me." "Is this necessary?" Muyang had already received the sword fragment from Han Sung. Muyang had also handed over the sage's potion to Han Sung. The sword fragment had somehow become part of their barter. But was it not an item that was necessary in order to solve what the king of the dragons asked? The fact that Han Sung had given it to him so coolly bothered him. "I made a rough copy." As he wasn't really concerned, Han Sung waved his hand. Then the shape of the sword fragment was created in his hand. In a manner similar to the 100 swords, he was even able to create a copy of the sword fragment. It wasn't 100%, but he could create an imitation that was 80 to 90% accurate. It's not perfect, but there should be no problem investigating. Also, Han Sung turned his head. People led by Pendragon were running over from far away. "My disciple is quite obsessive. Just don't kill him." Kurng. Arkisa gave a short cry. When she flapped her wings, a strong gust of winds shook the surroundings. Finally, just as how he had arrived, the Dragon Lord Han Sung left like a wind. Of course he didn't just go. "Next time we will have a proper fight," he mouthed. A proper fight. Even though he didn't want to, that's what he thought. Win or lose, next time he would face him properly. So Han Sung also had to show everything. Someday. Definitely. Muyang clenched his fists tightly. After Han Sung left, Pendragon made a devastating expression. "I know that he normally gets restless, but I never thought he would leave without a word." The Dragon Lord Han Sung wasn't the type of person who stayed at one place for very long. He roamed all around the underworld to be called someone with wanderlust. Since he had earned about 3 secret classes, one could get an idea on how many adventures he's been on with knowing that alone. Pendragon turned his head and looked at Seraphina. "Master wanted me to experience the world. Will you allow me to accompany you for a while?" However, it seemed like he wasn't discouraged. Instead, he looked at it as another opportunity and made another plan. Seraphina laughed awkwardly. It was already decided for Muyang to become the first knight. The only position that could influence cult judges. However, Pendragon didn't care about that anymore. Although he didn't earn the position, he was going to earn true love. Pendragon was young. He was high-spirited. He also had a big dream. He was also not the type of man to be discouraged by one defeat. If he was that sort of person, he wouldn't have been able to become Han Sung's disciple. Although Muyang got the first night position, he was all fired up to gain Serafina's true love. Muyang shrugged his shoulders. Han Sung's disciple. There was definitely something to gain from him too. This is good. Muyang fought with Han Sung 10 days and nights, using only pure technique. Han Sung's swordsmanship wasn't structured, but it was completely strong. A master that forgot the formulas because he fought so much. To be honest, Muyang's swordsmanship was no more than a copy of Sword 1 and King Slayer's. Mixing the skills he learned while at the Forest of Death, his attacks were very aggressive, but there were some parts that were lacking. He found out about his limits in his one-sided attacks with Han Sung. I want to make my own swordsmanship. Simply earning skills and raising stats wasn't everything. The basics. The pillars must be strong and high for the building to be built higher. Following Sword 1 and King Slayer, Muyang wanted Han Sung's swordsmanship. And Pendragon was the one who was most influenced by Han Sung's swordsmanship. Since copying was the mother of imitations, Muyang was planning to create his own swordsmanship by analyzing Han Sung and Pendragon's swordsmanship. I never thought that a swordsmanship under my name would appear. Muyang grinned at the thought of what happened a few days ago. After fighting with Han Sung, he wielded his sword a few times under the moonlight to get a little enlightenment. Perhaps you could say Muyang was relaxed by the moon. And suddenly, for the first time, a skill related to swordsmanship had appeared. Skill name: Muyang's swordsmanship. Muyang's unique swordsmanship that he has started to make on his own. It is currently incomplete, and when it's completed, its rank will be decided depending on the result. There wasn't much explanation, but the fact that it was incomplete was important. Muyang was slowly completing a swordsmanship in his name. Through the fight with Han Sung, Muyang gained a lot of inspiration. The sage's potion he exchanged for it was definitely worth it. Since Muyang had gained a piece of King Slayer's sword, Muyang, who was looking at the sword piece, changed his gaze. Han Sung left. Pendragon was the only one left. Pendragonim, Muyang is already decided as the first knight. I know. I am not planning to compete against him. I'm just another house guest is here. I need the approval of the first knight. Then Pendragon's expression wrinkled for a moment. He was willing to compete against Muyang. But he needed Muyang's approval to follow them. It was painful to hear the words without being drunk. I have a condition. You need to duel me at the same time every day. Muyang coolly spoke. The difference between the two was already completely opposite. But the reason why he still wanted to fight against him was because there was still something to be gained from it. Just because someone was weak, it didn't mean nothing could be learned from them. Muyang was planning to do everything to complete his own swordsmanship. It was a challenge to bring out his own uniqueness that didn't exist in the past and was unique in this world. Something that only Muyang could do and should do. How could his heart not race? But Muyang's meaning was simply distorted. In Pendragon's standpoint, it seemed as though Muyang was using his powers against him. Although he said it was a duel, it would be nothing more than one-sided violence. Pendragon had already acknowledged the skill difference between him and Muyang. For now it was like a wall he couldn't climb over. Although it was a pure fight, he had never seen a person who tried to fight Han Sung equally and succeed. He's trying to show Serafina how he wins over me every day? All kinds of thought came to his head. However, Pendragon was far from a pessimist. He's a man whom my master acknowledged. There must be something I could learn from him as well. These days his skills were stagnant. The breakthrough could be Muyang. They say women are attracted to men who work hard. It was Han Sung's theory. Regardless of victory or defeat, women liked men who tried their best. If he was to fall down, he just needed to get back up. Pendragon's eyes were ablaze. Then he vowed to himself that he will learn everything he could from Muyang. I understand. Their exchange was ended with slight nods. In the same duel, different motives were exchanged. There was no way Muyang didn't read Pendragon's sudden change in attitude. It's no different than two people with the same destination but different routes. However, they needed to see who would reach their destination and who wouldn't be able to. There was something that changed when he became the first knight. First, it was the gaze of the surrounding priests and paladins. I never thought he would really become the first knight. They say he also became close with the Dragon Lord as well. I thought there would never be a first knight for Seraphina. Because they were people too, it couldn't be helped for them to feel a bit of jealousy and envy with their surprise. However, Seraphina's iron wall-like defense was well known even in Mulalin. How many were there before him? Maybe more 50? As many as 50 people competed to become Seraphina's first knight. They all met the conditions to become a first knight. If anyone could compete, more than 500 people would have jumped to compete for the position. And among the 50 people there were city owners and their children, even dominant figures of guilds and clans, and also Mulalin's high priests and paladins. But they all failed. It was because the standard of Seraphina was too high. But this test was questionable, and so people talked. They say the contestants only completed the basic test, right? Not the 10 trials? If those who competed hear about this, there will be a storm of protest. Seraphina's 10 trials were famous. Because so many people wanted to compete, Seraphina personally made the trials hard. But this time she only made her contestants complete the basic test. Of course, Muyang passed without any difficulty. In fact, it was enough for all 50 challengers to pass the test. In other words, the 50 past challengers were just played for fools. Seraphina had also heard of people talking, but she dismissed it at once. He is a person who is qualified to have a sword duel with Dragon Lord Han Sung. What happened within the palace was only known by a few saintesses who were at the place. Of course, priests and paladins didn't know that Muyang fought with Han Sung. Those who heard of Seraphina's story made a more surprised look. The qualification to have a sword duel with the Dragon Lord. Although her words were a bit ambiguous, it really depended on how you interpreted it. He had strength similar to the Dragon Lord. He was a man acknowledged by the Dragon Lord. He was a man weaker than the Dragon Lord, but he had the potential to become stronger. Many ways to view her words. It was also said he had extremely noble blood. As a result, the malice towards Muyang disappeared and only the mystery about him remained. The power of words. Of course, he had no interest in what people talked about. It was because from the beginning, after Han Sung left, Muyang continued to stay within his room, only leaving to duel with Pendragon. My own swordsmanship. His commitment to be free from imitations and to create an original swordsmanship of his own. There was nothing more different than this from his past as a tool. There was no day and night for Muyang. Although Han Sung said he forgot about the structure, his swordsmanship was naturally melted into his sword. That was how important the type of swordsmanship was. I want to encompass everything. The sun and the moon, the sea and the sky, the softness and the firmness, the swiftness and the slowness. Everything. He was almost becoming a croc because he was so focused and thinking about just that. Within just a week, his cheeks were slimmer and dark circles drooped under his eyes. It was because Muyang concentrated that much into creating his swordsmanship. As if he never concentrated on anything this much before, he continued to focus on it. If it wasn't for Seraphina, he would have turned into a skeleton. And when 1 week had passed, Muyang came out of his room. I can't make it here anymore. He needed to experience everything to create something that encompassed everything. Of course, revenge was also part of this. In the past, when Muyang eradicated the forest of death, it wasn't a revenge in the truest sense. It was just a struggle. How could it be considered a true revenge when he killed everyone and even killed himself at the end? A true revenge was taking everything from his opponent and making everything he took his own. Seraphina's eyes greatly widened after seeing Muyang come out from his room. Are you done? Muyang shook his head. Instead, he gave her a short reply. Let's go to Suicide Hill. Let's go see Wang Chunglin. The Diablo's altar was originally at Suicide Hill. Of course, there were also priests of Diablo. Enemies recognized as a cult by Mulalin. Even by their size, since Diablo's priests were no match against Mulallin's, they couldn't help but to have to live in hiding. There was no room for them in the underworld where Mulallin lead. O Vestal, the dirty seeds of Mulallin are dirtying our mountains. Please give us an answer. Please pour endless despair and curses upon them. Inside a dark cave, within a huge void, hundreds of priests in black robes kneeled and bowed their head. They wished for an answer as they called out their Vestal. To them, Mulallin was also their enemy. Although right now Mulallin was stronger, they were an enemy that needed to be destroyed. But the paladins of Mulallin were climbing the mountain without any hesitation, as if they already knew that the priests of Diablos were already at this place. If they were to stay put, they wouldn't be able to survive. Then a woman who was on the altar raised her face. They will never be able to dirty our mountains. Thump. She smacked her cane down. At the same time, the entire mountain shook once. A huge crystal talisman was on the cane. Talismans were the strength of the archangel that allowed wishes to come true. When the woman's power was added to it, there was an overwhelming presence. Also, the woman's voice was alluring. It was that much deep as well. Although her face wasn't visible because she used a cloth to cover her face, she still stole everyone's gaze. The woman also had another characteristic. The wings that were stretched beautifully. A woman with both a black and white wing. She was the Vestal of Diablo's altar. Muyang was still moving around with his armor and helmet on. He was drawing out his own world at the front of the line beside Seraphina. The sword I have is cold-hearted. The sword he learned for 40 years while he was part of the Forest of Death was only cold-hearted. The fastest and most effective way to kill someone. It was a sword that cut infinitely for that sole purpose. However, that wasn't enough. For him to create his own sword, he needed to experience and learn a lot more. In that sense, the Kingslayer was the perfect fit. Kingslayer. His sword was honest. However, it was too honest that it was scary. It recognized every weakness and only went in that fixed direction. It excludes everything that blocks in the middle. Even if he wanted to imitate Kingslayer's sword, it wouldn't be easy. But Muyang couldn't just give up, and so he tried to fit himself into that frame in some way. Sword 1. His sword also had another color. It was like a spider web. It was very dense. It wasn't fast, but it was that much prudent and stable. And lastly, Dragon Lord Hansung. It was a swordsmanship that he dared to call a death sword. Although Muyang had watched him for many years in the past, he was able to know it better now that he experienced it himself. Hansung didn't have a frame. That was why it was so irregular. His unique colors took away Muyang. Muyang was planning to take the advantages of his swordsmanship, get rid of the disadvantages and add his own color to it. It isn't easy. This was an opportunity. Rather than repeating the past, an opportunity to walk an entirely different path. If there was a god of creation, wouldn't it feel like this when he created the world? If there was something Muyang was better off with, it was that the direction he was supposed to go towards was already given to him. They say that the cult members are gathered at Suicide Hill. As Seraphina rode a horse, she received communications from a small crystal, and this information was told to them. Then Pendragon tilted his head. Cult members? Are you talking about heretics? Normally, Mulallin doesn't call people heretics, just because they didn't serve the same god. It's because Mulallin believed the root of most gods was the mother of everything, idea. However, heretics weren't followers that served normal gods. They worshipped either evil gods or the demon gods. They called those who followed them heretics. And Muyang knew why the heretics were gathered on top of Suicide Hill. Diablos, priests. Originally, Muyang needed to head towards this place after gathering the 3 rings. However, thanks to Lucifer, he didn't have to go to the altar because he was able to mimic divinity. They say they were unable to confirm which cult religion it was. Just that they are followers of a strong evil god that can even move mountains. Do cults still exist? I thought they were all destroyed. Pendragon clicked his tongue. In the past, when demon gods first invaded the humans, humans started to fear and worship their strength. People tend to be attracted to something that is eviler, darker and more mysterious, as they believed it would protect them from the devil's attacks. But that was also sidetracked. After the invasion of the devils had ended, a few of them tried to become a privileged class. They gathered soldiers to create a city. They cruelly exploited people under the name of their gods. As the people who tried to benefit were left behind, those who were strong became more powerful and the Dark Ages had arrived. The power of humanity was in an extremely vulnerable situation. When everyone was being quiet, the sage king of Mulalin came forward. And for 10 long years, the bloody war that was called the Holy Battle had arrived. It was widely accepted that the cult religions and heretics were destroyed during that time. However, their roots weren't completely removed. They say there are currently 5 cult religions that are identified and are of considerable size. They're like cockroaches. There isn't any action being taken by the Sage King. The current Sage King doesn't really like wars. Ah, true. From my memories, he was like a kindly neighborhood grandpa. Serafina grinned. Then Pendragon secretly clenched his fist. He thought he could earn points like this from her. On the other hand, Muyang rubbed his chin. It seems like there were less than 10 people gathered there. From what Muyang could remember, Diablo's priests were weak. They were also small in numbers. At most, 10 people would be gathering near the altar. But they were followers of a powerful evil god who could move mountains. It's strange. It was clearly strange. It was something that a talented paladin could handle on his own. However, if a report was sent to Serafina, it meant that he was outclassed by them. There is no one on Suicide Hill who I have influenced. Although butterfly effects were big, all of Muyang's actions had nothing to do with Diablo's altar. It meant that there was no reason for a heretic to become stronger in power all of a sudden. However, there was something that was bothering him. Snow. The only variable for Muyang. That was correct, snow was a variable. If she was really here, he was unsure what would happen on Suicide Hill. I think we need to hurry. Serafina erased her smile and spoke. If a report was received, it was sort of an SOS. It meant it was hard to cope with just the military power there. Currently, Serafina brought about 2,000 soldiers. She basically had the military power to fully find out what was going on. Muyang was also really curious. I don't know what your intentions are, but... Muyang was uneasy about Snow. He didn't know the reason why she was trying to help him, and the reason why she approached him was unclear. But the moment he pledged himself to create his own sword, those worries all disappeared. The current Muyang was different from the one in the past. But who Snow wanted could be the Muyang in the past. That was really true. She should wait for me. Muyang's gaze became bleaker. The corpses overflowed. The rotten scent was strong. The ground had also died. All the surrounding grass and trees were stained black and were split. Suicide Hill was a place where low mountains were gathered. Because it was always heavily fogged and those who got lost weren't able to come out alive, the location was called Suicide Hill, so that they could let people know of the danger. It was definitely heavily fogged. It was even hard to distinguish what was in front of you. Start the cleansing ritual. As Serafina spoke, the priests came out. There seemed to be about 200 corpses in the surrounding. Then they started the cleansing by uttering the names of the earth and the sea god. The fog disappeared and the rotting smell also reduced. At least the ground was stabilized. However, not everything was cleansed. Gwa, push. The corpses that were touched by the divine power got up. The priests who were closest to the corpses were killed first. Undead. They're undead. Why would undead react to divine powers? Serafina hurriedly turned her horse's head. Knights to the front. Serafina screamed as she drew her sword. She needed to protect the priests. If all the priests die, they would be unable to go through these deep hills. The divine powers don't work? It was quite far from normal. Muyang quietly grabbed Anguish. At least, the paladins and the priests' divine powers didn't work against undead. On the other hand, the undead absorbed the divine powers and became stronger. When they were pierced by a sword with divine powers, they quickly regenerated. Everyone couldn't help but be taken back by the situation they never experienced before. However, there was also something else that was strange. They don't attack me. To be exact, undead were avoiding Muyang. Although he drew anguish, the few hundred undead didn't enter the area Muyang was at. As if they were avoiding something they were afraid of. Muyang forced in and cut up the undead. Then the undead turned into dust and blew away. My divine powers work. Muyang looked at anguish and the undead that became dust alternately. For his experiment, he placed divine powers onto anguish. Although the undead absorbed other divine powers from paladins and priests, they reacted as if Muyang's divine powers were deadly poisonous. Was it because the source of Muyang's divine powers was from Archangel Gabriel? Swish. Zep. When everyone was taken back and were helplessly attacked, out of nowhere arrows flew in and pierced through their heads like skewers. Swoosh. Zoe. Afterwards, another few dozens of arrows dropped at once. Don't use divine powers. Those undead absorb divine powers. In the middle of all this, a woman appeared with her long blue hair blowing in the wind. She was also riding the same breed of white horse as Serafina, but she was wielding a huge bow. Cult Judge Ramiella. The newly appeared woman was one of the 7 cult judges. At the same time, a few thousand soldiers came out from behind Ramiella. They skillfully sliced off the undead's heads and instantly cleared their surroundings. Phew! Ramiella let out a sigh after she placed an arrow in the middle of the last undead's forehead. Ramiella. When the undead were cleared, Serafina quickly got off her horse. Then she went towards Ramiella. Serafina seemed happy to see her, but Ramiella's face took on a set expression. It's been a long. Serafina, are you planning to kill all your soldiers? Serafina removed her smile as she heard Ramiella's question. What do you mean if I'm planning to kill all my soldiers? Your circumstantial judgment is so slow. Did you not see how the undead absorbed the divine powers? But you didn't give any orders but just stood there. If it wasn't for me, your soldiers would have just died. Do you know? Ah. Serafina nodded her head. It was her mistake. Even though she saw the situation, her judgment was delayed because she was taken back. For every second she was late, one person died. If Ramiella didn't appear, there would have been huge losses. Please pay attention. This place is a battlefield. Ramiella, I'll keep that in mind. You cannot perform the cleansing ritual carelessly, since corpses can become undead. Why aren't the undead affected by the divine powers? That I'm not sure myself. I was barely able to confirm that the Diablo's heretics are hiding in Suicide Hill. Ramiella shook her head. Although Ramiella had heard the god-killing spear was in this place, she hadn't heard about the heretics. Serafina was also taken back. Anyways, Serafina, let's move to the gathering point. I understand. Please don't forget that although you were the top candidate to become a saintess, you are now a cult judge who needs to make better decisions than anyone else. Serafina stopped talking. Ramiella let out a small laugh. Who cares if she was one of the best candidates to become a saintess? Now she was just a bad cult judge. When Serafina was about to turn her horse's head around, Ramiella asked her another question. By the way, you got yourself a first knight? Where is he? Beside Ramiella, there was a huge man who seemed to be over 2 meters tall. A knight was a huge greatsword. He was a man who seemed to be a match for 100 men. He's... Serafina turned her head. And she frowned for a moment. He wasn't there. Muyang disappeared without a trace. He didn't run away leaving his cult judge behind, right? He isn't that sort of person. Then why isn't he here? That's... Serafina didn't have anything to say. He was definitely here just a moment ago, but where did he go off to in that short period of time? Ramiella scoffed with all her strength. You really suck. Wait. Aren't your words a bit too harsh? Suddenly Pendragon came forward. It was because although they were both cult judges, their conversation was too aggressive. And you are? I'm Pendragon. I was a candidate to be Seraphina's first knight. Ramiella smirked. Which means you aren't her first knight? That's true, but either way the real first knight isn't the type of person to just run away. He is very strong that he doesn't need to. Then why isn't he here? I'm not sure about that. But I hope you'll be cautious of what you say. Aren't you both cult judges? Your conversation doesn't sound friendly. It's just our way of expressing our affection. Isn't it true, Seraphina? Seraphina nodded weakly. Pendragon looked weird for stepping up. Pendragon knew that his image would only become stranger if he stepped up any further. That's what Seraphina says, Pendragon. Don't intrude on what doesn't concern you. Ramiella turned her horse's head. Pendragon's face turned red. Are you really okay? When Pendragon asked Seraphina as he suppressed his emotions, she replied weakly. Yes, but have you not seen Gale? No, I haven't. Where could he have gone? Seraphina seemed like she didn't have any strength. However, even at this moment, how could she look for the man who suddenly disappeared? If it was him, he would have protected Seraphina by her side no matter what. The problem was he couldn't say it out loud right now. And so, Pendragon didn't say a word. Muyang ran. He ran and continued to run. He didn't need to be secretive. The people he was pursuing were the ones Muyang looked forward to meeting in the near future. The dead branches shook wildly. Muyang's heart also raced wildly. Right now the ones who were running away from Muyang were the ones who watched Seraphina and the priests from afar. The forest of death. Muyang smiled widely. How long did he wait, longing for this moment? He ran tirelessly towards a different path from his past. Muyang's goal was only Wang Chunglin. The rest of the assassins were no different than Wang Chunglin's scapegoats. However, it seemed like Wang Chunglin came to Suicide Hill leading a number of assassins. The assassins didn't speak. Instead, they were connected by a single command system. Their orders were clear. If there are any followers, to get rid of them. Muyang didn't hide. He quickly shortened the distance between him and the assassins. It was obvious for him to get caught. 5 assassins stopped and looked at Muyang. Muyang also looked into their eyes. Assassins in the 100th number. Familiar faces. Those who could be considered his comrades as he trained with them in the past. Assassins in the 100th number were strong enough to kill most strong men. They were classified as high-rank assassins and 10 were above their rank, the Great Assassins and Wang Chunglin. If 5 100th numbered assassins were to gather, they would be able to do the work of one great assassin. And a great assassin could assassinate one of the top 10 humans by himself. Muyang was also a great assassin in the past. However, he wasn't just a great assassin. He became number 0 after he killed Wang Chunglin. 5 100th numbered assassins weren't a match to Muyang. Don't blame me. Muyang spoke softly. It was Wang Chunglin who brainwashed them. Even if they were no longer brainwashed after years, decades of trying, they wouldn't be able to live a normal life. Nevertheless, Muyang was a very special case. He gathered few hundred thousands of people's status viewers. The status viewer was a compass that pointed to the person. Their information, the path they walked, everything was written in it. Muyang read them all. That was how he kept his identity. However, for the rest, they were no different than breathing dolls. Swoosh. Numerous hills rolled up. A different trial existed on every hill. However, Seraphina and Ramiella advanced without hesitation. Although people might say things about the two, they were both cult judges. They were able to reach the meeting point in half a day because they were 2 of the 7 cult judges who were selected among few hundreds of thousands of people in Mulan. Ramiel. The cult judges have arrived. Not just 1 but 2. We are now able to live. Everyone cheered. The gathered were in critical condition. There were tons of people who were suffering from critical injuries and moaning in pain. As proper treatments weren't readily available, They were just maintaining their current conditions. Even those who were moving normally seemed very tired. The fact that their enemy continuously attacked them day and night, and the terror that their divine powers didn't work against them, pressured them enormously. For the power of a divine empire, the power of God to not work against cults, it was unthinkable. It's nice to meet you. Cult Judge Ramiel, Cult Judge Serafina. You are the vice captain of the Hafener Paladin group. Are you the one giving orders at this place? Serafina asked first. Then the person who was called the vice captain nodded his head. His armor was ragged and he had a splint on one arm. The past commander, Tooth, gave his life for us during a battle. So for now, although I'm lacking, I'm the one who is leading this place. It's really terrible. It wasn't Serafina. Ramiel, who descended from her horse, made a bitter remark. I have no face. The vice captain bowed his head. There were about 10,000 paladins and priests who left for Suicide Hill. There was that much interest, and it was a situation Mulalen was actively watching over. But what was this situation they were currently in? The Mulalen status could not be felt at all. It was truly a remnant of a defeated troop. After 10,000 men came, not even half survived. On top, most were injured. There were at most 2,000 men they could use for battle instantly. Please explain to us. Exactly what cult religion has this much power? Serafina carefully asked. The cult religions were the ones that were needed to be destroyed. That should have been the case, but instead they were the ones who were suffering. It was necessary for them to approach them more cautiously. The vice captain started to talk. Do you know Diablos? Isn't it a devil that exists in literature? There was no one named Diablos among the 72 demon gods and their subordinates. However, when you read the ancient literature, he would solemnly appear in stories destroying the world. The vice captain nodded his head. To be exact, Diablos is a demon god in a different world, not this one. Perhaps he might be the devil within our imaginations. Normally, Diablos' power should not be inherent. Isn't that the limits of the heretics? Yes. The gods that don't exist or the evil gods are extremely reluctant to give out their powers. That is why there aren't many followers with their strength. But, gulp. The vice captain gulped his saliva. His pupils shook greatly. There's a witch who has both white and black wings, is being revered as a Vestal by the heretics. Black and white wings. Serafina was startled. She recovered quickly, but she couldn't do anything about her beating heart. Are you saying she has 2 pairs of wings? Yes, she is a being who is human but not human. Someone who isn't of a form. The vice captain's body shook. It was enough to know how severely they were destroyed. She's similar to Muyang. But Muyang had 3 pairs of wings. However, Muyang did not follow an evil god. Because of his strength, his divine powers were saintliness itself. Of course, the fact that he had wings was definitely an unusual thing itself. Not just that. There are people who are helping them. Ramiel stepped forward. She spoke with a disgruntled look on her face. A place that helps a cult is another cult itself. We need to consider them all with the harshest punishment. It isn't easy as we think. They are the deepest darkness of mankind. Do you happen to know of the Forest of Death? Are you saying the Forest of Death is involved in this? Ramiel's voice became cautious. There was no way she wouldn't know. The Forest of Death was the darkness of mankind. It was the place that was created when all kinds of ugly emotions came together. However, no one knew the true nature of the place. It was a strict cell. Even Mulalen tried to find out about them for decades, but they only skimmed the surface. Everything was unclear as to how many members made up the organization and how many groups there were and who was in charge. Many priests and paladins were assassinated. Even I was wounded after an attack by one of their assassins. There was no confidence in his words. Someone who was recognized and had the position of vice captain of a paladin group had already lost his fighting spirit. In reality, no one survived the assassination attack. Even if there were any, they all soon disappeared within a few days. They would continuously go after a target they have set their eyes on, even if a few years or a few decades passed. The persistence was enough to make someone quiver. The vice captain was aware of his death. He knew that he wouldn't last long as the forest of death was after him. Be careful. You need to be alert of your surroundings. The assassins of the forest of death used all kinds of extraordinary methods to go after your life. Ramiel and Serafina's expressions hardened. Of all times for it to be the forest of death. It was the only place Mulalin couldn't really do much about. Although they presumed the size of the forest of death was the size of most huge organizations, there was no way to know for sure. Of course, even information known was limited. From now on they needed to face the shadow and the Diablos' altar. Every day they shivered in the fear, struggling to keep it in check and be alert of an enemy they didn't know existed for certain. The influential power of the 3 words, Forest of Death, was greater than one's imaginations. Blood was splattered. The splattered blood was on his face. Muyang didn't even think to wipe it off. He continued to raid the places where the assassins hid. It was obvious where they hid their bodies. They hid themselves from outsiders completely, but Muyang had been a part of the Forest of Death for 40 years. It was too easy for him to find the places where the assassins would hide. On top, he needed their blood in order to find out where Wang Chunglin was. Blood is the medium. Wang Chunglin placed restrictions on his strong assassins. He restrained both their body and their soul. The blood was the medium for his brainwashing. However, thanks to this, it was also his weakness. The blood of strong assassins was the only guide to find where Wang Chunglin was located. It was because Wang Chunglin needed to mix his own blood to place a strong restriction. The assassins I met in the great city were all low levels. With a fragmentary order they moved simply. But the assassins at this place at Suicide Hill were on a different level. Muyang collected the assassin's blood and refined it. He started to extract only Wang Chunglin's blood and collect as much of it as he could. The problem was, for him to move with certainty, he needed to collect the blood of at least 50 assassins. Wang Chunglin, did you bring the entire forest of death? That part was clearly resolved. The number of assassins hidden at Suicide Hill was more than he imagined. From the beginning, it seemed like Wang Chunglin brought over the main military strength of the Forest of Death. It seems like you're not simply after the god-killing spear. Muyang didn't know what he was after, as everything at this place was a variable itself. He didn't try to think about it either. However, Wang Chunglin made a mistake. Like usual, he should have moved with just a few. It became easier for Muyang to act because he brought everyone. By now, Wang Chunlin would have also noticed that something was wrong. He would have recognized that someone was hunting his assassins. Will you run? Or fight? However, it was still too late, as Muyang was steadily headed towards where Wang Chunlin was located. Of course, he didn't move without any thought. Art of Death. The dead assassins were revived. In a much more stronger form. They would become Muyang's minions and act. A dog biting the owner who raised it. How would it feel? Spat spat. Suddenly, a rain of daggers poured down from the sky. At least a few thousand daggers started to pour down like rain. Muyang quickly twisted his body and used his thorn formation. Swoosh. While Muyang was busy blocking the daggers, he felt someone behind him. Instinctively, he felt danger. Even if his defense was solid with his thorn formation skill, he couldn't help but be weak against a strong one-blow attack. Swift. Muyang reacted faster. As anguish pierced through the air, an assassin who wore black clothing made one full turn in the air before landing on the ground. The mask the assassin wore was cut in half and dropped on the floor. Anguish didn't just pierce through the air. Muyang smiled again after seeing the assassin's face. It was because he was able to find out Wang Chunglin's decision. If Wang Chunglin had sent this man, it meant that Wang Chunglin was willing to fight and not run away. How could he not smile? If Wang Chunglin did run away, Muyang would have been disappointed. The Great Assassin. Number 10. The one who was after Muyang was a great assassin. One among the 10 people who represented the forest of death. On top, the great assassins especially knew each other very well. A part of their mind was shared. Although it wasn't the case anymore, he felt like he met his family. The words that felt like they would overflow out of Muyang's throat were forced down. It's been a while. Instead he vomited up blood. Great assassin number 10. There were countless needles in his body. With his first showy attacks he distracted his opponent and attacked. And if even that was blocked, the long needles inside the back of his hand would fly out and attack his opponent's fatal point. He hasn't changed. Muyang had narrowly avoided it, but it was important that he had blocked the assassination. The great assassin was a shadow designed to face humanity's top 10 strongest. But he only knew how to face them by assassination. Of course, if the assassination was unsuccessful, the expectation would drop significantly. This was the reason why Muyang was able to erase the forest of death in the past. He had cut most of them down head-on without giving them much time to kill. Because Muyang also had 4 classes at that time, he wasn't very weak in the head-on confrontation. However, Muyang had also died in the process. It was because the traps he had set up in doubles and triples using all of his might had been easily penetrated by Wang Chunlin. There is no need for traps anymore. If the great assassins were able to kill the humanity's top 10 strongest in a head-on confrontation, then humanity's strongest group would be the Forest of Death. However, if the assassins were identified and fought openly, 5 great assassins would have to gather to deal with one of the 10 strongest. Furthermore, people like Dragon Lord Hansung were out of the question. Muyang's military force was ranked among the 10 strongest. This was a simple calculation, and if he used all his skills he would easily be among the top ranked. There was no need for him to set a trap and wait for his opponent to be caught in it. Muyang would seek them out. Muyang knew all the paths of the game like the back of his hand. Now Wang Chunlin on the other hand had set a trap to catch Muyang. He wiped his mouth. He had gotten caught once on purpose. It was like a greeting between the great assassins. Let's do this properly. However, one greeting was sufficient. He slowly pulled out Anguish. Fung. Before he knew it, the sky was darkening as the sun set. In the low dusk, Muyang's sword burned with the last flame. Wilderness. Soon the world was influenced by Muyang's color. A violent sandstorm blew in. Muyang unfurled Gabriel's wings. 3 horns sprouted on top of Muyang's head. Twachwakwak. Number 10 stretched out his hands as he felt something strange. Then countless needles gushed out from the back of his hand. Strong poison and magical powers were overlaid so that a fair amount of skin would be pierced at once. Muyang covered his body with his wings. Gabriel's wings represented justice. All the power to justify Muyang's actions were in these wings. Twawak. Number 10 jumped into the air and spun his entire body like a top. Thousands, tens of thousands of needles started to pour down like rain. Mass destruction. It was number 10's main ability and his strongest attack. Those who died from this method numbered in the thousands. Muyang released his wings. Then he wielded Anguish and met all the attacks. In a world that was moving 8 times faster, Anguish cut down thousands of needles one by one. A move that could be called superhuman. It was literally none other than a head-on confrontation. In the meanwhile, Muyang moved one step at a time. However, he continued to keep his eyes on number 10. Was that all he could do? It was a rebuke. Then numerous needles squirmed inside the 10th's entire body. The needles stimulated his entire body and awakened number 10. A high-risk technique. It was number 10's strongest technique that reduced his lifespan by about 10 years, but also strengthened his body by that much. Originally, number 10 had to run away after his assassination had failed. That was the guideline for all assassins. However, number 10 did not run away. He couldn't run away. This place was inside of Muyang's barrier in the middle of his wilderness. A place that maximized all essences. In this place Muyang looked different than before. An enormous body that was close to 2 m and 3 pairs of wings that seemed huge enough to touch the sky. Anguish had also grown large enough to match his body. On the other hand, what about number 10? Are you afraid of me? Number 10 was the same. However, Muyang could tell that his soul was trembling violently. Muyang played with Anguish. Number 10 blocked, but his moves were inadequate. As Muyang flapped his wings, an intense typhoon blew in that direction. Dozens of tornadoes rose and hit number 10 hard. From the get-go, number 10 was unable to defeat Muyang in a head-on confrontation. The same was true even if they were not in his wilderness. Number 10's entire body began to break into pieces. The art of death. Soon the winds died down. Only bits of flesh littered the ground. In that state, Muyang started to create something. He studied number 10's soul until he got to the bottom of it. He tried to discover his essence. Amazing. The Death Lord is thrilled. Art score. Swake. Muyang erased the score. It wasn't something made for someone's appraisal. He had no desire for it to be judged. This was only for Muyang and the assassins. It was a soundless song that only Muyang and the assassins could know. Taiwea. The pieces of flesh joined together and formed one shape. At first glance it looked like a large dog. The problem was that it was around the size of a decent adult. However, it had shaggy fur and tail. The fur was as hard as steel. As soon as it was touched, it would bore through everything, and the dog could control the hair on its entire body freely. Number 10 liked dogs. The dog number 10 had been with since childhood had died when he turned 15. It could be said that the dog had lived a long life, but number 10 had lived his entire life with his dead dog in his heart. However, Muyang couldn't find number 10's image. Muyang was only able to find a dog engraved into his soul. I am sorry I couldn't find who you are. Muyang extended his hand. He petted the dog's hair. The strong fur softened for a moment. It was normal for it to bore through everything, but Muyang was the only exception. From now on I will call you 10. Bark. 10 affirmed it. Soon Muyang released the wilderness. Although he had extreme dehydration, Muyang finished it with a shake of his head. Muyang watched 10. He made 10 and there were things he learned naturally. Find your siblings, 10. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Diablo's altar shook. In front of it, the Vestal's eyes were closed. Then she muttered to herself. Number 10 has fallen. I know. A heavy voice rang. Perhaps it was a voice she had heard somewhere before. A voice that sometimes sounded feminine and sometimes masculine. Sometimes he was like an adult and other times he was like a child. An utterly unpredictable being. The master who led the forest of death was here in close range. The Vestal continued speaking without care. He can join the cause with us. He gives off a dangerous vibe. Like myself, we definitely have to get rid of him. Didn't I say it? That strictly speaking, he is like your disciple. Disciple. The shadow snorted. Afterwards he spoke mockingly. You said you saw the future. The destruction of the world, the subsequent descent of false gods. A world where everything you believed disappeared and only lies remained. That's right. The forest of death that you led disappeared, and after that there was chaos itself. The world, the universe, all dimensions received destruction. I am just a shadow. You found and you desired for me. It was only a slightly different wish than the others. Stop the destruction of the world. I am sure. He's the one that will destroy the world. He is not similar to my disciples. The shadow stuck to his guns. The Vestal sighed. He is a blessed being. From light and darkness, chaos and everything else. You, a mere shadow, can never be victorious in a fight with him. Are you sure? The shadow laughed. He had no thoughts of losing. He now knew Muyang as well as Muyang knew him. The Vestal had seen the future and said that the shadow would be defeated. But there was nothing absolute in the world. The Vestal spoke anxiously. Do not oppose him. You cannot defeat him. He is a shadow like me. The shadow gradually faded away. He left a final word. So, the deeper one will survive. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. With the attack of the monsters began. Numerous undead filled the mountain. That number was well over 10,000s. Build up a line of defense. Protect the priests. Seraphina and Ramiela were struggling. However, the attacks of the enemy were endless. Even worse, if they were killed by undead, they themselves would become undead. The holy city of Mulalin. It was something that could never happen to warriors blessed by God. Divine power was literally divine strength. It was incompatible with death and could never be invaded by evil. That should be the case, but the paladins and the priests became undead and started to rise again. Furthermore, if a priest died, he would transform into a dark priest that could restore the undead. On the other hand, Mulalin's priests and paladins were unable to use divine power. If they did, the undead reversed that strength, absorbing it and becoming stronger. A hollow fortress. Of course, there was no way that a proper fight could proceed. What about reinforcements? Are there no replies from the other cities? It was a situation where Seraphina and Ramiela had sent out an SOS to other cities besides Mulalin. As they had asked for help in the name of Mulalin, they wouldn't be able to just ignore it. However, it was important to endure for that time. Retreat. Seraphina. I will stop the front. In the end, they couldn't win against a fight of attrition. Even though their numbers were similar, they were undead that didn't fear death. They continuously increased tirelessly. Even more, no divine powers worked either. What's that? The sky. However, retreat didn't seem easy either. In a moment, the sky was black. A huge shadow was eating up all of the sky's light. Coyote. Bone dragon. The highest class of undead. Because they were made of dragon's bones, the name given to them was a bone dragon. 2 bone dragons flew in the sky. And several shadows jumped to the ground from on top of it. The shadows rapidly dispersed and killed their troops. No one dared to stop a shadow. Gook. Ramiela gave a short cry. It was because in the shadow's attack her side had been open. Her first knight had hurriedly blocked it, but it had only bought them some time. Muyang Nim. Seraphina gritted her teeth. She believed that there was a reason that Muyang was missing. Muyang was hope. She just hoped and prayed that nothing would happen to that hope. 5 shadows passed the hill. Among them, 2 flowed into the demon god's territory and found a territory. It was a place where all kinds of species including duckibis lived. 2 shadows invaded that place and began to massacre. Another one headed for the great city. It entered the luminescent guild and found Kim Taehuan there. The other 2 were heading towards the fighting king and Bei Suzy. A move to cut off everyone connected to Muyang. The remaining 4 dealt with Mulalin. They found Seraphina and caught the fairy. Muyang, who had moved with 10, could also feel that. The feeling of the connected threads breaking one by one. Wang Chunglin. That bastard also knew Muyang now. Muyang had to choose what method he would take. However, one thing was certain. Muyang was not feeling very good right now. The territory was full of energy. Apart from the natural problems posed by different creatures associating and living together, it could be said that Deputy Lord Baltan and Siohan were doing their best work. The population that had stagnated for a short while after the Devil's Long Night had increased exponentially as time passed. Most of all, the combination of the dwarves' craftsmanship and the knowledge of the humans was more than enough to protect the ever-increasing number of citizens. Although it was normal for people to become lazy when the basic needs were cared for, Baltan and Siohan did not let this come about. We must achieve more before our Lord returns. Siohan was particularly zealous. Siohan was the chief of the Duckibis. As a Duaxini that had evolved from a Duckibi, he never refused to take the lead if something happened. But Siohan's mind was urgent. The emergence of a new strong person errand. Territory Guardian Baltan's growth was also increasing daily. On the other hand, for some reason, Siohan felt as if he was marching in place. So, he wanted to contribute a remarkable achievement in his own way. Increase the territory. Our enemies do not exist where resides. The main task was precisely expanding the territory. The territory's population had passed 50,000. Most of the races living in the demon god's territory reproduced rapidly, but as they grew, the weak usually died. However, the people whose food, clothing and shelter were taken care of under the territory were only growing endlessly. More still, there were immigrants flowing in from the outside, and at this rate the land would soon be scarce. Seohan therefore intended to increase the land available. Among the Dakibis that numbered over 20,000, there were only 10 other Duaxonis like Seohan. Sees a far path different from us. We should be of aid. The Dakibis worshipped and Hum. Was the king of the Dakibis and Muyang was However, Seohan thought that Muyang was no ordinary He was perhaps the most powerful in all of history. Seohan could not catch up at all to the pace of Muyang's advancement. He couldn't even figure out the path Muyang wanted to take. Muyang's judgment was so completely different from Seohan's. Seohan couldn't see even the short lines of the picture Muyang drew. But he wanted to be helpful. In order to do that, he was prepared to jump into the heat of the fire. Seohan looked at the front. That place was a forest that was close to the territory. An area where superior monsters called Naga was located. Monsters whose upper bodies were human-like and whose lower halves were shaped like enormous snakes. Strange. However, the forest was so quiet. He was accompanied by around 10,000 Dakibis, but they didn't see any Naga at all. But there was a disgusting smell. The smell of rotting corpses. It also reeked of foul entrails. Urk. A shadow. A shadow has. At the same time, the Dakibis in the rear screamed. Seohan turned his head with a frown. He didn't see any shadows. However, the moment he looked away, his companions disappeared. Even Duaxonis were among those that disappeared. An assassination. But he didn't know who the opponent was. Everyone stand together. We have to catch the shadow. Seohan was enraged. Although it was a foreboding affair and normally he would have retreated, Seohan was stubborn. It was because he felt an unknown evil. It was because for some reason, there was a smell similar to Muyang's that reeked all around. More than 200 Dakibis had disappeared in just 2 hours. Show yourself. Seohan gritted his teeth and thoroughly searched his surroundings. Rustle. A blade of grass a short distance away trembled slightly. There you are. Seohan quietly gripped his weapon and immediately sprang forward. Poof. An enormous rod split the air. However, there was a man wearing a black mask riding on top of the rod. Seohan immediately realized that it was the masked man that had attacked the Dakibis. The bastard isn't a shadow. Catch him and kill him. As Seohan shouted, numerous Dakibis attacked. The bastard couldn't escape now. No matter how agile he was surrounded by Dakibis. More so as they found out that he wasn't a shadow, there was no easy escape for him. Kwang. Kwang. The surrounding terrain was destroyed with each swing of Seohan's weapon. His opponent avoided all of the attacks but was being driven into a corner. It was no different from a hunt. Seohan gave a satisfied smile. He slowly looked down at his chest. A long sword was penetrating his heart. There wasn't only one of them? Seohan had been careless. He hadn't thought that there might be 2 of them making a move. It was because the scars were the same as the ones of the dead Dakibis. Seohan took hold of the situation with both hands. Flash. His arm was cut off. Let Baltan and Aran know about this. Seohan completely changed his mind. The masked men were strong. If there were 2, they could not be caught by the Dakibis alone. However, there wasn't only Seohan and the Dakibis in the territory. If they knew and prepared, there was no reason they couldn't catch even real shadows. Without caring, a screaming Seohan bit the masked man in the neck. Chomp. Tumble tumble. The moment he bit his neck, his head rolled on the ground. The masked man felt the bite marks on his neck for a moment. 1 for now. 2 remain. Bang. Soon the 2 masked men threw smoke bombs. They were smoke bombs made from materials that dulled the senses and caused confusion. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Crack. His arm was broken. Gurk. Kim Tae-hwan threw up blood. A dark alley. Kim Tae-hwan's condition was terrible. One eye was bleeding, one arm was bizarrely broken, and his guts were pouring out of his stomach. A situation where it wouldn't be strange if he died immediately. But he couldn't help but ask. Who sent you? Kim Tae-hwan had many enemies. There had been some people that had been upset when Kim Tae-hwan was on a roll in the Luminescent Guild. However, he had never felt this much malice before. Soon the Black Shadow spoke. Mu-young. Kim Tae-hwan's eyebrows furrowed. Lies. He didn't believe it. It was unbelievable. It was also nonsensical for an assassin to rashly say the name of his client. He knew it was just to cause confusion. Kim Tae-hwan wasn't a fool. Now I see. You're associated with Hyung Nim. Pathetic bastard. Why, of all people, did you meddle with Hyung Nim? He spoke from the heart. There was no one that messed with Mu-young and survived. By killing me, do you think Hyung Nim will be shaken? Hyung Nim, even though other people might shake him, he will never shake. But, gook. As he laughed, he threw up blood again. However, the shadow didn't respond. Instead, he slowly lifted the bloody silver knife. Kim Tae-hwan forcibly swallowed his blood. If it was Mu-young in this kind of moment, what would he do? As he worried about him, the answer soon came. Kim Tae-hwan said with a smile. Kill me for sure. Because if not, I will chew you to death. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Herc. Covered in cold sweat, Bae Suzy sat up. Hoo. She quickly wiped her face and slapped her cheek. A nightmare. She'd had a terrible nightmare. She still couldn't get her heart to stop racing. Did you have a bad dream? The man who had laid down near the bonfire turned his head and asked Bae Suzy. Bae Suzy swallowed her saliva. I have to go back. You can't go back. Now that you have become my disciple, you have to follow me until you have mastered all the divine writings. Didn't I already tell you this? Even so, I have to go back. Bae Suzy opened her eyes wide and stared at the muscular man, the Fighting King. Over the past year, Bae Suzy had been forced to follow the Fighting King. Because in actuality she had been kidnapped from the Sky Library. After that, the Fighting King seemed to be searching for something, but he was soon thrilled with Bae Suzy's talents and immediately took her in as a disciple. The Fighting King shook his head. You can do whatever you want if you achieve our mystery door. But before that you have no freedom. How long will that take? At least 8 ranks are needed to attain a mystery door. I achieved 10 ranks, and even the Great Door Master could only achieve up to 11 ranks. However, if it's you, you could achieve rank 12. At this pace, 10 years should be enough to get to 8 ranks. The Fighting King said with pride. As Bae Suzy's talent was truly surprising, he got the taste for teaching every day. Someone that could possibly attain the legendary stage of rank 12. Reaching the 8 ranks in 10 years was absurd. Because even the Fighting King took 30 years to get to 8 ranks. In 10 years it will be too late. However, that is the discipline of our mystery door. Ugh. Pay. A whip flew in. The whip had a strong electrical current. The Fighting King grimaced, caught the whip with both hands and dragged in his opponent in that way. Even with the strong current, it didn't even scratch the Fighting King's body. Then the Fighting King smiled at the shadow that had appeared. So, you're one of the assassins of the Forest of Death. The Fighting King was searching for the Forest of Death and its master. But this was how they showed themselves. The Fighting King slowly turned his head towards Bae Suzy. Take a good look. I will show you the power of our mystery door. The Fighting King threw the whip on the ground and got in position. After this, he threw his fist into the air and a strong wave surged forward. Quack-quack-quang. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Mu-young looked up at the sky. Twilight. But he couldn't hear even the small sound of a bug. Fung. Mu-young took out anguish. Schwack. Crack. And he cut through the stone walls that blocked the cave. As he entered the cracked cave, priests in black robes looked at Mu-young. It's the enemy. Stop him. Fuck. One person, one step. Mu-young slowly advanced. There was no hesitation in Mu-young's hands. He cut down everyone in his way. Although it was a dark cave, it looked as bright as daylight to Mu-young. Diabolo's altar. The place where Mu-young was currently standing. This place was an altar. It was hidden in such a remote place that hardly anyone knew of its location. Normally he would have to gather 3 rings to come to this place, but now his purpose had changed. Snow was at the end of this. A saintess who had blocked the armies of the Demon King. However, that was also a story of the past. There was a woman with the wings of both an angel and a devil there at the altar who was now truly unfamiliar. A woman who had helped Mu-young numerous times but who was now standing in opposition for some reason. Snow, you will have to tell me about your relationship with Wang Chonglin. At first he had been curious. Why was Snow finding out about Mu-young? She even seemed to have at least a slight expectation that Mu-young had come from the future. But now he was even more curious about something else. This was fine in any case. Wang Chonglin. How was that bastard able to find out about those that were associated with Mu-young? Even more, it seemed that before this situation had arisen he had sent out assassins. If he had been able to know in advance and send them, then the cause could only be Snow. But if Snow truly wanted to maintain a good relationship with Mu-young, it was only right to exclude Wang Chonglin. In the past she was a saintess, but now she was Diabolo's Vestal. Obviously it was a different past from Mu-young's memory. She who had strived to save mankind was now on the opposite side. He didn't know what her connection to Wang Chonglin was, but her journey was so different from in the past. Mu-young was certainly incredibly curious about what justification Snow would give. The Vestal saw the destruction of the world. Everything was dark. In the end nothing remained. Humanity had already been exterminated, and what happened afterwards could be compared to the Big Bang that began creation. No one wanted such a future. However, the Vestal saw a small light in the darkness. Yes, it was truly a small light. However, the Vestal was able to realize that the existence of the light was Mu-young. The problem was that the light was very weak. It was brighter than any other, but compared to the darkness that had come for the world, it was the light of a firefly. The light is wandering. Mu-young didn't know his own worth. He only had a vague idea about it. That shouldn't be. More than anything, the light that illuminated the world had to be straightforward. The Vestal saw all the past events. And the shadow snuck a look at all the Vestal's recollections and visions. There it learned about Mu-young and also his related facts. That fellow isn't like my disciples, Vestal. The shadow rose up to the ceiling and looked down at the altar. The Vestal was on her knees praying continuously. Bastard. Mu-young wasn't the shadow's disciple or anything of the sort. But then again, the shadow was someone that didn't exist. He was a being that stayed behind someone's back and moved based on their ambition. Furthermore, as the Vestal saw, Mu-young was shining. Shadows didn't shine. Didn't you silently wish for me to do this? I also felt this in your memories and in your heart. The Vestal denied it, but the shadow knew. That the Vestal hoped that the shadow would become a trial itself and force Mu-young to choose. She had tried to contact the shadow for that one purpose in the first place. She was hoping he would be the catalyst, so that the light can proceed in the right direction. In other words, the shadow was an essential obstacle for Mu-young to surpass. However, the shadow had no intention of making Mu-young into the sun. Mu-young, you are the light, but you have the disposition of a shadow like me. Rather, like himself, he wanted Mu-young to become a deeper shadow. So first he took care of it himself. He sent other shadows to people who were associated with Mu-young. The Vestal had seen the future, but she didn't know everything. She didn't know that Mu-young had the qualities for becoming an even deeper darkness than the shadow himself. No, perhaps she was pretending not to know. Furthermore, the Vestal said that the shadow would lose. However, the shadow had no intention of engaging in even a simple armed fight in the first place. This was a battle of whether Muyang would become darkness or light. If he became darkness, the shadow would be victorious, and if he became light it would be the Vestal's victory. And Muyang's victory? Muyang would be victorious either way. Because he had no choice but to be victorious. From the start he had the qualities to become anything. Amazing. The shadow couldn't remember being as emotional as this. It seemed that perhaps the Vestal's memories and emotions had been assimilated when he peeked at them. There he had seen Muyang and found out more about him than Muyang knew about himself. Such as Muyang's real name and even what he did on Earth. So the shadow was curious. What would you do if you were confronted with the truth? Something he had never experienced before. Even the shadow was extremely interested in the outcome that would arise. Rumble, rumble. Shook. Enormous giant statues moved and blocked Muyang. Diabolos. We offer you our bodies. The heretics used the self-sacrifice spell. The bodies of the heretics melted and soon flowed into the giants. They became the material that moved the giants. The self-sacrifice spell was a great magical spell that could only be used once by someone serving a god. The god was able to amplify his ability to influence the world and create something close to a miraculous event. About 100 heretics gave their lives for the self-sacrifice spell. The 5 giants gained superhuman strength. Kwang. Purung. A strong energy surrounded the giants. They had fire, water, wind, earth and metal energy respectively. Blink. Muyang traveled a short distance in a flash. The blink ability on Isaac's boots. Because he could move indefinitely if his destination was visible, it didn't take much to avoid a large attack. In a flash, Muyang, who had moved behind one of the giants' necks, brandished anguish. Crack. The rock was split. However, it regenerated in an instant. This was because there was the strength of 20 lives sacrificed added to each giant. Tisich. Muyang briefly clicked his tongue. While coming this far he had already fought hundreds of monsters. Fatigue was accumulating little by little. The enemy is alone. Assist the giants. The priests of darkness came out in droves. Muyang frowned. If he confronted them head-on, even Muyang would not survive. Naeghai. A horse's leg was severed. Ramiella. Ramiella fell from her horse. Serafina instantly approached Ramiella while wielding a sword. Ramiella's first knight had already become a corpse after being defeated. Because of the shadow he had died protecting Ramiella. Mulalin. Cannot lose. Ramiella kept repeating as her face went pale. Mulalin was pride. The god they served was absolute. They must never be defeated by evil. However, the evil before them had neutralized even the power of their god. Rather, they had snorted and tried to absorb even that power. They had never been so helpless. Mulalin was the icon of justice in all mankind. You have to retreat, Ramiella. Serafina persuaded Ramiella. If they retreated now, it would be possible to at least protect the minimum number of people. But Ramiella shook her head. She put her hand on the ground, got up and grabbed her bow again. There is no longer anywhere to retreat to. If we retreat here, their power will grow even stronger. Ramiella seemed to have made up her mind. However, it was hard to regain the momentum that had already been lost. Every time the bone dragon exhaled, thousands of priests melted. The paladins' shields and armor also melted easily. By God. Everyone called on their god. Serafina was the same. However, they couldn't win. Even so, she couldn't go and leave Ramiella behind. Serafina raised her sword again. And the moment she ran towards the shadows and the bone dragon, Pong! A huge typhoon formed in the sky. Soon, a black sphere fell to the ground and swallowed everything up like a black hole. A divine bolt of lightning struck the surroundings and burned up many of the undead. What the hell? Something that happened suddenly. Serafina turned her head. Soon she could see 2 horses. A hell horse and a unicorn. There were other undead joining them. Undead attacking undead. It was a situation she was seeing for the first time and Serafina was dumbfounded. In that situation, someone burst out from the ground. Please do not worry. We are servants of Myung Nim. A lich. Seraphina took a step backwards. A strong evil energy was flowing out of the man before her. However, a similarly strong divine power could also be felt. We are Myung Nim's servants, the man said again. Then Seraphina opened her eyes widely. Gale was a fabricated alias. The angel's name was Myung. Seraphina knew him. Please relax. The man Bei Sungmin picked up his staff. Kwang, kwang, kwang. When he pointed the staff repeatedly, explosions occurred here and there around him. When he used his other hand, the fallen people in the surroundings began to be healed. The enemy undead couldn't absorb Bei Sungmin's divine powers. Seeing that, Seraphina shuddered. Up until now, she had half disbelieved the prophecy. The person with black wings will destroy the world. One more thing had been added after that. The one with the white wings will save the world with his servants. Kwang. The sword that tried to pierce his neck was stopped. You're right on time. Kim Tae-hwan opened his eyes, which had been closed. A man made of bone and a vampire covered in a cloak were side by side. It was precisely Taken and Kala. They stopped the shadow's attack and began to talk to each other. Teleport. I just imitated it. Without your magic, it would have been difficult to travel this distance. Taken shrugged his shoulders. He hadn't been sure if it would work, but it seemed to have turned out well. You weren't just stealing swordsmanship? There's nothing like a thief, huh? In any case, that bastard Myung made me, and it seems he added even more skills. Anyway, you calling me a thief is not nice to hear. Kala clicked his tongue. Taken could steal the majority of the skills he saw. This was also true for the teleport skill that Alexandro Quintart used. On the other hand, there was no way to steal Myung's acceleration or ability to read grains. Taken spoke shortly to Kala. Also, this is a secret. This is a trump card I've saved to beat that bastard. The person he called a bastard was Myung. Taken's goal had already become Myung. Do as you wish. However, he is an extremely sinister man. Kala turned his head to look at the shadow. The shadow had slipped into position and had finished preparing to attack. When he used his teleport skill to the place where Myung's magic was the most strongly entangled, he arrived at the current situation. Taken secretly looked Kim Tae-hwan over. Let's end this quickly. He's going to die soon. If he dies, can't I just take him and turn him into an undead? Myung wants him to be alive. He does. Kala asked as if caught by surprise. Why did Myung, who used the dead, want with a living person? Taken shook his head. Myung wants the warmth. That was the conclusion Taken had come to. They dug into the cave. They ruthlessly cut down anyone in their way. Should I help you? Lucifer, who was existing inside Myung, whispered. This was the first time that Lucifer, who had been quiet up until now, made a proposal. I will do it alone. However, Myung shook his head. Anguish became even bloodier. Lucifer jeered. It was foolish to go all the way to the end of this cave without his help. Myung was also fully aware of that fact. However, Myung would never give up. When Myung finally reached the end of the cave, Lucifer had no choice but to stop jeering. Diablosalter. At that place there was a woman on her knees praying. Black and white wings coexisting. With his entire body covered in wounds, Myung looked at the scene. You're finally here. The Vestal slowly rose from her prayer. Her face was no different from Myung's memory. If there was a difference, it could be said that she looked a little bit more mature. Snow. The Vestal smiled sadly. You have passed every trial. In the end, you chose the correct path. You saved your colleagues and didn't refuse to come all this way. Are you saying you planned everything? Please calm your anger. Everything was for your sake. Furthermore, you should know it. The future that will happen. The future. Myung laughed. With this he was certain. He could see the future. Perhaps she had also returned like Myung. And she knew more than Myung did. The world had been destroyed. Because of the 72 demon gods and the false gods. In the underworld, angels and true gods don't exist. Isn't it a fact that you knew all this and turned away? Even the divine power that the priests of Mulalin use is not the power of a true god either. The Vestal reached out her hands. Soon their surroundings changed and the future destruction of the world was displayed. The whole universe disappeared. A world where all but utter darkness existed. I have seen it. You would have seen it to some extent as well. Because we had the same dream, but... Dream. Yes, like me, you only had a dream that was a little long. Snow was thinking of the past that Muyang had suffered as a dream. But Muyang never dismissed it as a dream. It was a torturous reality. Even if he wanted to avoid it, he couldn't. But she called it a dream. Muyang thought of the Snow of the past. Everything had been in a veil. However, Snow had been Muyang's target for assassination. Because of this, he'd watched Snow closer than anyone. The Snow of the past had been extremely practical and devoted. To the end, Snow had been the one moving to help even if it was for only one person. As he came all this way, he kept having doubts. However, you two will know now. In the end, you can't save everyone. No matter how much you try to, you have limits. If I help you, you will be able to burn with an even brighter light. She who had been so devoted to mankind had reached out to evil. She had dismissed the entire past she had suffered as a dream and was trying to create a completely different path. He couldn't save everyone. Now that he was face to face with the Vestal, he knew. You're not really Snow. Feng. Muyang pulled out anguish. The Snow in front of him had the appearance of the Snow in his memories. But that was all. Her substance was completely different. He wasn't saying she was fake simply because her arguments were different from in the past. Muyang sincerely thought that the person before him was not Snow. Then Snow's face stiffened. You could become an even stronger light. Didn't we dream the same dream? Do you want history to repeat itself? History repeating itself. Humanity would be destroyed once again. She said that the demon gods gained power and killed even Muyang. Of course Muyang would change the past. However, I am not the light. Furthermore, it's not a dream. Don't you want to know about your true self? I mean yourself before you came to the underworld. But Muyang stopped in his tracks. Himself before he came to the underworld. Certainly, even the name Muyang that he was using right now was not his real name. He had absolutely no memories of before he came to the underworld. He would be lying if he said he wasn't curious. Even so, Muyang shook his head. I don't want to know. The present moment was important. A resolution that he had made ever since the forest of death had been erased and he returned to the past. The name Muyang was enough. He didn't need anything else. He could create his true self from now on. Also, now Muyang was taking on his own uniqueness. The only one that existed in the world. Nothing else could replace Muyang. Snow's expression changed subtly, to a face that wasn't smiling, crying, or even hardened. What do you want? Do you really want to become a shadow? Why are you trying to judge my identity? Because I saw everything about you. Therefore I can tell. Muyang grinned. He knew the reason for her frustration. The self-titled Snow might certainly know Muyang better than he knew himself. But no matter how far she had seen, she was talking only about the surface. Snow didn't know what kind of mind Muyang lived with day by day. She didn't know how frantically and how stingily he lived. Even breathing was often painful. Flashes of the past tormented him when he closed his eyes. However, Muyang never expressed himself. As the saying goes, the past was important. The fact that the present Muyang had been created by the past could not be denied. However, he couldn't make the mistake of forgetting to move forward while looking only at the past. Therefore Muyang always only faced forward. Forcing himself to pretend that he didn't know that the past was gripping his shoulders from behind, he was only concentrating on running forward. You don't know. Snow didn't know this. However, if he had to decide on one identity, there was one word Muyang liked. I will become neither light nor darkness. Not good, not evil. A definition that was Muyang's alone. Then, Snow's body shivered. Could something exist while being neither light nor darkness? The world was formed in those two. Of course it was fundamental to base things on those two. However, Muyang's response was a little different. The absolute. Weiwok. His wings sprouted. Muyang had 3 pairs of wings. From the top there were white, gray and black wings. And now those 3 pairs of wings were starting to be harmonious. Eventually all 3 pairs would be gray. It was corrupt but not corrupt. Muyang had simply established his own justice. Due to Gabriel's authority, Muyang would never be corrupted. Snow, who saw his wings, shouted in amazement. I beg you. The path you want to take is chaos. There is nothing at the end of it and nothing can come of it. Did you say you saw the future? Muyang walked. If the path he wanted to take right now was chaos, then her words wouldn't be wrong. However, he didn't like that confident tone of her voice. The future changed. It was not decided. So Muyang asked one question. What will you look like in 3 seconds? Wait. Muyang's body disappeared. And the place he appeared was directly above Snow. Before Snow could even react, Muyang's anguish cut the top of her head. Indeed, something that happened in a flash. When Muyang landed on the ground, Snow's entire body was split in 2 like firewood. But he didn't even need 3 seconds. Muyang wiped off anguish as Snow fell to the ground. The energy of death. But soon Muyang couldn't help frowning, because a large amount of death's energy could be felt coming from Snow's body. Black smoke rose up from out of Snow's corpse. Blood seeped into the floor and created a 6-pointed shape. Crack. The ceiling started to crack, an indication that the cave was going to collapse. But Muyang was focusing on the altar. Is this your answer? Rumble, rumble, rumble. Crack. The ground shook. Cracks appeared here and there. The 6-pointed shape was like a symbol of the demon god's token. And Muyang had seen a 6-pointed shape like that multiple times before. The Star of David. A mark that came out when the demon gods were summoned. When he had entered Gremory's temple at the Blue Temple, that mark had been there. Snow had used even her own existence as a medium, so an extremely dangerous being had been summoned. Its body was well over 10 m tall. It had red skin and giant goat horns. At first glance it looked like a dragon, but it was quite different. As it stood on 2 feet and let out an eerie shriek, flames hotter than hell soared up everywhere. Muyang seemed to know that being Diabolo, the 73rd demon god, was born into this world. The ground ruptured. As the sky turned red, it was like a sign of the end of the world. The other 72 demon gods felt the wave of the violent soul. They knew it was the emergence of a new demon god. At the same time, they could also tell how destructive of a demon god Diabolo was. Like water and oil, they could not be mixed. Diabolo was going to destroy everything. Of course, he would have no choice but to confront other demon gods in the process. As the first demon god, he sat on a great throne and saw that place for the first time. But as he tapped the throne with his finger, a black bolt of lightning burst out and struck Diabolo. As the size of the lightning bolt was to the extent that it covered a mountain, Diabolo was forced to stagger. But he was unscathed. Ball tapped the throne twice. Then a tidal wave, which seemed like it could cover the world, approached. The tidal wave swallowed Diabolo. Everything around him was cleanly devoured. However, Diabolo broke through even the tidal wave. Red wings unfolded and he rose up into the sky. At that moment, the sky became even redder. Soon many fireballs poured down like rain around him. Everything was aflame and even Baal's eyes were disturbed in the blaze. Even the flames of hell were no match. Diabolo's flame was like an extremely pure source. Eventually, when Baal tapped the throne 3 times, Diabolo suddenly disappeared like smoke. Baal closed his eyes as if nothing had happened. After 10 minutes at most. Following the mountain-sized black lightning bolt and the tidal wave that seemed to cover the world, Everything was evaporated by Diabolo's flames. All that remained was an infinitely burning land. Muyang cleared away the wreckage and got up. Baal. Muyang could sense that it had been Baal who had attacked the 73rd demon god Diabolo. He was the only one that could attack at this scale from an unseen location. No one had ever seen Baal, but his attacks were dared to be associated with the word extraordinary, a level that could overpower the great city with one attack. Baal attacked Diabolo. Muyang noted that fact. Baal, who could be called the true king of the 72 demon gods, had made a move. It meant that Diabolo's emergence had offended him that much. Because Baal had noticed as soon as Diablos appeared and attacked. Fight fire with fire. Suddenly those words came to mind. A way to suppress poison with another poison. He had made a powerful move to contain the 72 demon gods. However, Muyang, who had suffered from Diabolo for just a short moment, had no choice but to shake his head. Even if Diablo was keeping the demon gods in check, he would only continue to be a destructive being. Muyang could feel Diabolo's desire to paint this world with his fire. He's extreme. Muyang looked around. The six-pointed shape had been left in the place where the demon god had emerged. It was called the Star of David, and it was left behind at trials related to the demon gods. The staircase heading beneath the altar caught Muyang's eye. A soft light was there. The black light escaped from the place where Snow's body was, and the small light left at the end flowed towards the staircase. Pyrong. Pyrong. The armful cradle's spirit that had been hiding in Muyang's hair reacted. The armful cradle wanted Muyang to go down the stairs. You mean there's something down there? The world was engulfed in flames. Diabolo's flames made the skin burn just by being next to it. He certainly didn't know what was in there, but Muyang slowly took a step forward. As he continued down the steps beneath the altar, another large temple appeared. It looked magnificent, as if it had been made beforehand. Sculptures of Diabolo had been erected everywhere. Gasp. At that moment Muyang turned his body like a top. It was because someone behind him had tried to assassinate him. The back of his neck was cold. It was clear that he had almost lost his neck just like that. There was not even a 0.1 second difference. As he hastily withdrew anguish, Muyang stepped back and looked at his opponent. Diabolo carries the Origin's flame, so the rewards will also be beyond imagination. Do you not covet it? The opponent, who had tried to assassinate him, spoke in a laid-back manner. However, when Muyang saw his opponent, he trembled slightly. In that state he darted forward as he was. Wang Chunglin. No reply was needed. There was no need for words between them. The shadow Wang Chunglin appeared. With his face as it was in Muyang's memory. How could they speak gently? It was indeed the state of meeting an enemy on a single log bridge. Muyang had waited and waited for this moment. Wang Chunglin stopped when Muyang emerged. But he was bare-handed. Instead, his hands were shining white. Minority Ball. It was a technique that most firmly supported the hands. It shined white like that if one was a sage. Muyang had also mastered it in the past, but he had been unable to become a sage. Pig. Wang Chunglin's smile revealed his teeth. Ping. Ping. It was an extremely violent collision. Muyang's sword narrowly cut Wang Chunglin's collar. The long black traditional jacket that Wang Chunglin was wearing shook precariously. Really? Can you see my attacks? Wang Chunglin glanced down at Muyang with slight admiration. Muyang's attack was extremely fierce. As Muyang's horns appeared, it was not the collar but the skin that started to be cut. Muyang knew about all of Wang Chunglin's movements. It was a matter of course. He had seen it for dozens of years, so he couldn't help but know. Furthermore, Muyang's skills now slightly exceeded the past. Even in the past state he had killed Wang Chunglin, so couldn't he just kill him now? Fuck. One of Wang Chunglin's arms flew into the air.